It was a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1985 when everything changed for the quiet coastal town of Fairhope, Alabama, the kind of small town where everyone knew each other, where doors were rarely locked and children played freely in the streets until the porch lights came on. Among those children were two sisters, Abby and Jennifer Reynolds, ages 8 and 10, known for their bright smiles, wild imaginations, and the little red wagon they pulled everywhere. That afternoon, they waved goodbye to their mom, promising to be home before dinner and set off down the street like they always did. But this time, they never came back. What started as a typical day turned into a nightmare that would haunt the community for decades. The girls were last seen near the edge of town, close to a stretch of woods that bordered the shoreline. A neighbor reported hearing laughter and the familiar sound of their wagon wheels squeaking against the pavement. But within the hour, that sound faded and the sisters seemed to vanish into thin air. No struggle, no screams, no signs of where they went, just silence. Authorities were called, search teams were formed, and for days, volunteers combed the woods, the shoreline, and every back road they could find. But nothing turned up. It was like the earth had swallowed them whole. The red radio flyer wagon they loved so much was never found either. To their parents, it was more than just a toyette, was a symbol of their bond, their adventures, their innocence. As weeks turned into months and months into years, theories ran wild. Some believed they had wandered into the ocean. Others feared they had been taken. The family never gave up hope. But over time, the world moved on. Their photos, once taped to every telephone pole in town, slowly disappeared. The case turned cold. But the pain in their parents' eyes never faded. Fast forward 15 years. It's the year 2000. A commercial fishing boat named the Mirabelle was trawling just a few miles off the Fairhope coast. It was a clear morning, the kind fishermen dream of calm waters, good visibility, and steady nets. But as the crew hauled in one of their final catches for the day, they noticed something strange. The net felt heavier than usual, not with fish, but with something solid, something unexpected. At first, they thought it was a piece of debris or an old crab trap. But as the bundle came closer, the shape became eerily familiar. Wrapped in seaweed and coated in rust was a children's red wagon. The name on the side, though faded and chipped, was unmistakable. Radio Flyer. It was just like the one Abby and Jennifer had the day they disappeared. The crew stood in stunned silence. One of the older fishermen, a Fairhope native himself, immediately recognized it. It had no place being out there that far from shore. The wagon looked worn by time and salt, but there was something haunting about the way it sat in the net like it was waiting to be found. Word of the discovery spread quickly. News trucks arrived, and the once-forgotten story of the Reynolds sisters was suddenly on everyone's lips again. Police reopened the case, and forensic teams began examining the wagon. But more shocking than the wagon itself were the items found inside it. Tucked between layers of seaweed and muck were small, water-damaged remnants, bits of fabric, a child's shoe, and something that looked like a piece of a handwritten note. It was almost too much to believe. For their mother, now gray-haired and weary but still carrying the weight of unanswered questions, the discovery stirred a mix of emotions. Part of her felt hope, another part, dread. Could this finally be the break in the case she had prayed for? Or was it just another cruel twist in a story that had already taken so much? As investigators dug deeper, questions started to rise faster. Then answers. How did the wagon end up miles offshore? Was it thrown there, or had it slowly drifted out over time? And most importantly, could it finally lead to the truth about what happened that day in 1985? The town was gripped once again by mystery. Locals shared stories from that summer, rumors resurfaced, and old suspicions reignited. Some claimed to have seen a strange car near the woods. Others remembered a drifter who had passed through town just weeks before the girls vanished. Theories were everywhere, but facts were still few. For now, all anyone could do was wait. Wait to see what else might be revealed. Wait to hear if the wagon held secrets long buried under the sea. And wait to learn whether the truth would ever. It might be would finally come to light after 15 long years, because sometimes the sea doesn't forget. Sometimes it gives back what it's been hiding all along. And when it does, the story it tells can change everything. The discovery of that red wagon raised more questions than anyone could answer that day. But one thing was clear: the mystery of the Reynolds sisters was no longer buried. It had resurfaced quite literally with the tides, and what comes next is something no one could have prepared for. News of the wagon's discovery spread like wildfire. Local news stations led with the story that night, and by morning, it had made national headlines. Missing sisters wagon pulled from sea after 15 years. Reporters descended on Fairhope, a town not used to flashing cameras or satellite trucks. For the Reynolds family, the attention brought back a flood of emotions they'd long tried to keep buried. Their quiet life had already been shattered once, and now every unanswered question came roaring back. Detectives reopened the case officially. The wagon was taken to a forensics lab, where experts began carefully removing the layers of grime, sea salt, and rust. They cataloged every item inside the small canvas shoe, torn and water-damaged, which matched the kind Abby had been wearing that day. The strip of faded cloth with pastel colors, possibly from Jennifer's summer dress, and the fragment of a note, too smudged to read clearly, but still held with hope. Investigators weren't sure if they'd find DNA, but they were careful. Knowing any small detail could become the missing piece of the puzzle. As the investigation ramped up, the town of Fairhope found itself pulled back into the past. Many of the original officers who worked the case had retired, but the memories hadn't faded. Sheriff Donnelly, now in his 60s, agreed to speak on record for the first time in years. He recalled how he personally walked the shoreline, flashlight in hand, calling out the girls' names into the darkness. It didn't make sense, he said in a quiet interview. No sign of struggle, no tracks, just gone. The Reynolds family lived just a few blocks from the beach back then. It was a modest home, the kind where toys were scattered in the yard and drawings hung proudly on the fridge. Jennifer was the protective big sister, always looking out for Abby. They were inseparable whether it was building forts in the backyard, collecting seashells, or pulling each other around in that little red wagon. It was their favorite thing in the world. Neighbors would smile, seeing the two of them giggling as they rolled past on the sidewalk. That wagon was everywhere they went. Their mother Linda held on to every memory like it was gold. Even now, her house remained mostly unchanged. The girls' room had been preserved, left almost untouched since 1985. The beds still had the same bedding, faded now with time. A teddy bear sat on one pillow, a stack of children's books on the shelf. Some would say she couldn't let go, but she always believed they'd come home one way or another. As people remembered that summer, strange little details began to surface. Several neighbors spoke about a tan pickup truck parked near the wooded area around the time the girls disappeared. Nobody recognized it, and it was never seen again. Back then, it didn't seem important, but now it felt like a clue, lost in the shuffle. Another resident, Mr. Blanton, mentioned hearing voices down by the beach later that evening, voices hurried and sharp. He assumed it was just teens messing around and didn't think much of it. But looking back, it gnawed at him. What? If it wasn't nothing, one of the more chilling discoveries came from an old roll of undeveloped film found in the police evidence box. It belonged to a neighbor who had taken photos that same week for a family picnic. Most of the images were ordinary kids playing. A dog chasing a frisbee butt in the background of one shot, partially out of frame, was a red wagon. The girls weren't in the photo, but the timing and location matched. Investigators enhanced the image, but it was too grainy to tell more. Still, it was one of the last known pictures before they vanished. Back on the boat, the fisherman who pulled in the wagon, Eddie Morales, couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been meant to find it. Eddie had been working these waters for over 20 years, and not once had he ever brought up something like that. It just didn't feel random, he said. It felt like it was waiting there, like it wanted to be found. Some called it fate. Others believed the ocean, in its own time, had finally returned a piece of the truth as police followed up on new and old leads. They also began mapping ocean currents from that part of the Gulf. Marine experts suggested that if the wagon had entered the water close to shore, it could have drifted and sunk gradually, snagging on the ocean floor before being buried over time. The fact that it resurfaced now during one of the calmest seasons was rare. Some even questioned if it had been recently placed therein. Idea that brought more questions than answers. The story also caught the attention of amateur sleuths and online forums. People combed through old newspaper clippings, aerial photos from 1985, and even satellite images, looking for anything that had been missed. A few internet detectives pointed out a curious gap in the timeline. Between the moment the girls were last seen and when the first search party was formed, roughly an hour unaccounted for. Where were they during that window? Did someone lure them away? Did they follow a stranger? The case had always been full of dead ends. The lack of witnesses, no physical evidence at the time, and the sheer speed of their disappearance made it difficult. But the resurfaced wagon changed everything. It was more than just a toyette, was proof that something tangible still existed, something real from that day. And it meant there was still a chance to find out what happened. In the midst of all this, a new detective was assigned to the case, Rachel Monroe. She wasn't even born when the sisters vanished, but she took the job seriously. With a background in cold cases and a reputation for picking up overlooked details, she began piecing together everything from scratch. She re-interviewed witnesses, reread every page of the old reports, and paid close attention to even the smallest inconsistencies. Her goal wasn't just to reopen the file. She wanted to bring closure. But the more she looked, the stranger things. God, why was there never a single clear suspect? How could two children disappear in broad daylight, just blocks from home, without a single person seeing it happen? And now, with the wagon found so far out to sea, how did it get there? Was someone trying to cover their tracks? Or had nature simply carried it like a message in a bottle across the tides? One thing was certain, this case was far from over. In fact, it felt like the real story was only just beginning. And as the pieces began to shift, revealing glimpses of something darker beneath the surface, the town of Fairhope braced itself for what might come next. Because whatever the truth was, it had been buried for 15 years. And now it was rising. Detective Rachel Monroe sat in the quiet corner of the Fairhope Police Archives, her eyes scanning yellowed case files that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Pages crackled as she turned them, each one filled with statements, search maps, and photographs. The deeper she went, the more the inconsistencies began to stand out. Witnesses gave times that didn't quite match. Notes scribbled in the margins raised questions that were never answered. One detail in particular kept catching her attention. A delivery driver's log from a seafood company dated the day the Reynolds sisters vanished. The driver reported seeing two children near the shoreline around 4:30 p.m. But his note was never followed up. It had been filed, then forgotten. Rachel highlighted it and made a mental note to track him down. Meanwhile, the town was starting to feel uneasy again. For many, the disappearance of Abby and Jennifer had become a painful memory, something they kept tucked away like an old scar. But now, With the wagon pulled from the sea and the investigation front and center again, that scar was being reopened. People who had long stopped talking about that day were suddenly whispering in diners, at gas stations, and in church pews. Some were eager to help, while others seemed afraid to say too much. Linda Reynolds, the girl's mother, had become a quiet figure in town over the years. She rarely left her home, avoided interviews, and didn't engage with reporters. But one afternoon, she agreed to meet with Detective Monroe. Sitting at her kitchen table, Linda gently slid a worn scrapbook across the surface. Inside were photos of Abby and Jennifer's birthday parties, beach days, and lazy Sundays in the backyard. Linda's voice trembled as she spoke. "They were everything to me. Every morning I wake up hoping I'll hear their footsteps. And every night I wait for the sound of the front door." She paused, her eyes brimming with tears. That wagon. It was their world. They used to pretend it could take them anywhere. Rachel asked if there had been anyone suspicious around that summer. Linda hesitated, then mentioned a man who used to linger at the playground, always alone. She didn't remember his name, only that he had a limp and drove an old blue sedan. He never did anything outright threatening, but she remembered how he'd stare too long. That detail had never been in the reports back at the station. Rachel had her team begin searching DMV records for any blue sedans registered in the area back then. The process was slow. Many of the old files weren't digitized, but it gave her something to pursue. At the same time, she reached out to Eddie Morales again, hoping to learn more about where exactly he'd been fishing when the wagon was. Brought up, Eddie gave her the coordinates and described how the ocean floor there was rocky. It's not the kind of place a lightweight toy would naturally drift to. That wagon didn't just end up there, he said quietly. Someone put it there, maybe not right away, but someone wanted it gone. As Rachel mapped the fishing location, another question started to gnaw at her. What if the wagon hadn't gone into the water in 1985? What if it had been kept somewhere all these years and only dumped more recently? That would change everything. If someone had held on to it, it meant they were still out there, watching, waiting. In the middle of all this, a new voice entered. The storyteller Grant, a journalist who had been a teenager in Fairhope when the girls disappeared. He ran a small, online investigative blog and had spent years obsessing over the case. When he heard the news, he returned to town and reached out to Rachel, offering information in exchange for access. At first, Rachel was skeptical, but Tyler's research proved valuable. He had tracked old addresses, found yearbook photos, and even spoken with former classmates of the girls who remembered things that had never been documented. One girl recalled a strange substitute teacher that sprang quiet, odd, and overly interested in the younger students. Again, no name, but it was a thread worth pulling at the same time. Rachel started looking into other missing persons reports from the region in the early 80s and 90s. Surprisingly, there were a few cases with eerily similar patterns: young children, mostly girls, disappearing near wooded or coastal areas. None had been solved. Most were forgotten. But Rachel couldn't ignore the possibility that the Reynolds sisters weren't the only ones. Was it coincidence, or something darker that no one had ever connected? She brought this theory to her captain, who warned her not to jump to conclusions. "You have one wagon and a pile of speculation," he said. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was circling something real, something buried under years of silence. Subplots began emerging from unexpected places. An old fisherman confessed to seeing a man dump something off a small boat late one night years ago, but he never said anything because he'd been drinking and didn't want trouble. A former camp counselor mentioned how a group of boys once found what looked like children's belongings deep in the woods, but by the time adults arrived, the site had been washed out by rain. None of these tips gave solid proof, but they painted a troubling picture, one that suggested people might have seen more than they realized, and simply chose to forget. Even members of the original search party were interviewed again. Some admitted they hadn't searched certain areas thoroughly because they assumed the girls wouldn't have gone that far. Others confessed that they'd felt rushed, pressured to move on when no leads turned up. It became clear that mistakes were made, gaps were left behind, and now those same gaps might be holding the truth. Rachel started to feel the weight of the case settle on her shoulders. She knew eyes were on her, some hopeful, others skeptical. The Reynolds family had waited 15 years for answers. And now that the investigation was alive again, the pressure to find something, anything, was building by the day. Each lead seemed to open a door to another mystery. The wagon, once thought to be just a piece of lost childhood, had become a symbol of something far more complex. It had been silent for 15 years, but now it was speaking. And what it was saying was that this case was never truly cold, just buried. And someone out there might have done the burying. The question was, how much longer could they keep the rest of the truth hidden? Rachel didn't sleep much anymore. Her mind kept circling the same few images, the wagon dripping with seaweed, the worn shoe tucked inside it, Linda Reynolds' trembling hands as she turned the scrapbook pages. Every step forward in the case seemed to uncover another dead end, another closed door. And yet, deep down, she felt something was close. Too many strange details were starting to line up, forming the edges of a picture that was still blurred but taking shape fast. She had the feeling that if she could just connect one more dot, everything would shift. She kept returning to the note fragment found in the wagon. Forensics hadn't been able to recover legible words, but one analyst thought they made out the edge of a drawing something that looked like a sun with a smiling face. Linda confirmed it. Jennifer used to doodle suns like that in her journals. So if it really came from the girls, then the note might have been a cry for help or something they wrote just before they disappeared. That small detail haunted Rachel. It meant they were alive for at least a short time after they vanished. Meanwhile, the blog posts from Tyler Grant began gaining traction online. His audience had doubled in just 2 weeks. People were sending in tips, old photos, family stories. One anonymous message caught Rachel's attention. It read simply, "You're looking in the wrong place." It didn't start at the beach. It started in the campgrounds. There were no other details, but it stirred something. Rachel remembered that just outside Fairhope, nestled in the forest near the bay, was an old summer Camp Mariner. It had been closed for years after a fire destroyed part of the dining hall. She checked the files. Camp Mariner had run a small day program in the summer of 1985. She and Tyler visited the campgrounds. Most of the buildings were still standing, though overgrown and forgotten. As they walked through the decaying cabins and hollowed-out mess hall, Rachel felt a chill. The air was still, but heavy. In one of the cabins, carved faintly into a wooden bunk bed frame, were initials AR+JR side by side. Abby Reynolds, Jennifer Reynolds. It could have been coincidence, or maybe a cruel prank, but Rachel had a gut feeling. She took a photo and marked the coordinates. Later that evening, she met with Linda again. She brought up the camp. Linda's face froze. "They were supposed to go for 1 week that summer," she whispered. "But Jennifer got sick, so I canceled. They never went." Rachel showed her the photo of the bunk carving. Linda's breath caught. "That's Jennifer's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere." Suddenly, a new theory began to form. What if someone took them to the camp? Or what if they went anyway? Was it possible someone convinced them, maybe even someone they trusted? Rachel started digging into old staff rosters from Camp Mariner. Most of the counselors were now scattered across the country. One name jumped out: Dean Holloway. He had been 19 in 1985, working as a camp assistant. And he was the same man who, years later, had been quietly investigated for another missing child case in Georgia. Charges were never filed, but Rachel found the old report. It described a nearly identical pattern: a young girl vanished during a family camping trip. No evidence, no witnesses, and no resolution. Rachel's hands trembled as she printed it out. Dean had lived less than an hour from Fairhope in 1985. She pulled his old address. A small house near the woods, not far from the stretch where the Reynolds sisters were last seen. She filed a request for his employment history, and it showed something strange. Dean had worked at a coastal maintenance yard in the late 90s, just 10 miles from where the wagon was found. That couldn't be random. Rachel's pulse quickened. If he still lived nearby, she needed to find him before he slipped away. At the same time, new tests on the wagon revealed a surprising discovery: traces of paint and rope fibers that didn't match the original wagon were found inside. A marine biologist who reviewed the samples believed the wagon had been tied to something underwater, anchored. That would explain how it stayed in one place for so long, only breaking loose recently, which meant someone deliberately sank it. Someone who knew what it could reveal. Rachel was more certain than ever. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to hide it. She tracked down Dean Holloway's current residence, a rural property on the outskirts of Baldwin County, surrounded by thick woods and narrow back roads. Surveillance showed he rarely left. Rachel planned a visit, but not alone. She brought a team and requested backup, just in case. They were cautious: no accusations, just questions. But as they approached the home, Dean was gone. His truck was missing, and the back door had been left open. Inside, the place was sparse, like someone had been ready to leave. But in the corner of a dusty shed behind the house, Rachel found something that made her knees weaken: a rusted toolbox, and inside it photos. They were old, faded, curled at the edges. Pictures of children at Camp Mariner. Group shots, cabins, activity days. But in one of them, tucked near the back, were Abby and Jennifer, side by side, smiling, and Dean Holloway in the background. Rachel stared at it in disbelief. They had been there, which meant everything the family believed about that day had been wrong. The girls hadn't simply vanished near the beach. They had gone with someone they knew. And that someone had kept the secret for 15 years. Rachel rushed back to town to secure the evidence and issue an alert. Dean was now officially a person of interest, and his name was circulated to every nearby agency. But he had a head start, and night was falling fast. She stared at the photograph, her mind spinning with questions. Had he taken them? Was he working alone? And most of all, was it possible one or both of the girls had survived longer than anyone thought? The town, once quiet and peaceful, was now bracing itself. The truth was no longer buried, was inching toward the surface, threatening to shatter everything. Every phone call, every knock on the door could bring an answer or another disappearance. And as Rachel prepared for what was coming next, she knew the final piece of this puzzle was close. She could feel it. But what she didn't know was whether the truth waiting ahead would bring justice or more heartbreak. Rachel stared out the car window as the trees rushed past, her mind racing faster than the wheels on the highway. The photo of the Reynolds sisters at Camp Mariner had changed everything. It proved they were somewhere no one thought to look, with someone no one had suspected until now. Dean Holloway wasn't just a footnote in the case anymore. He was the thread pulling everything apart. But as the search widened and the press picked up the story again, something even stranger happened. A call came in from a woman 2 towns over, saying she recognized Dean from more than 2 decades ago. From Fairhope, but from her own childhood. Her name was Lacey Dorn. She was in her late 30s, and after watching the news coverage about the wagon, She started remembering things she had tried for years to forget. When Rachel met her in a small diner, Lacey was visibly nervous. Her voice shook as she explained that when she was about 10, her family had lived in a trailer park near the Bayou La Batre shoreline. One summer, a quiet man with a limp and a blue car started hanging around the neighborhood. He told her he worked at the docks and often gave out candy and toys to kids. He wasn't threatening, she said, but there was something off. He asked weird questions, wanted to know if we were home alone, stuff like that. Lacey said one day she saw him talking to a girl she didn't recognize, blonde, about 8 or 9, wearing clothes that didn't fit quite right, like hand-me-downs or something borrowed. She never saw the girl again. But now, looking at the old photo of Dean Holloway, she was almost certain it was him. Rachel felt a chill. Could there have been a third child involved? One who had escaped? Or worse, had there been more victims no one ever connected? As investigators worked to track down Dean's last movements, another twist surfaced: construction. Crew clearing land for a new development just north of Fairhope uncovered something buried beneath an old tree line. It wasn't human remains, but it was a child's backpack. Molded, worn, and nearly falling apart, but still intact enough to reveal the initials JR stitched inside. Jennifer Reynolds. Inside the bag was a plastic hairbrush, a broken wristwatch, and what looked like a small piece of seashell. Art, something handmade. It matched the crafts taught at Camp Mariner during the week the sisters disappeared. This find was miles from both the beach and the campgrounds, which meant someone moved the bag. But why leave it buried there? And what else might be hidden nearby? Cadaver dogs were brought in. The soil was tested. And while nothing conclusive was found yet, it was clear this wasn't just a random dump site, it was deliberate. And that meant whoever had placed the bag there was careful, methodical, and familiar with the area. As pressure on the investigation mounted, a strange message was left on the tip line. It was a man's voice, muffled and distorted. She's not the only one. You're digging in the wrong places. No name, no location. Just that. Rachel replayed the message over and over, trying to catch something, a background noise, a tone, anything that might help. But it only deepened the mystery. Was the caller warning them or taunting them? Tyler Grant continued posting updates on his blog, and one night he got an anonymous package left at his motel door. Inside was an old videotape and a note that read, "From the camp. You should see this." Rachel and her team scrambled to find a way to play the tape. What came next was even more disturbing. The footage, dated July 1985, showed children participating in a talent show at Camp Mariner. The camera was shaky, but steady enough to make out faces. Abby and Jennifer appeared briefly, sitting in the front row, clapping and smiling. But in the background, watching from the shadows near the cabin doors, was Dean. Just standing there, hands in pockets. Not interacting, not clapping. Just watching the tape sent a jolt through the team. Not only did it confirm the girls were at the camp, but it showed Dean close by and looking far too interested. The video was handed over to the authorities for digital enhancement. If there were other children in the video later linked to missing person cases, this might blow everything open. Rachel knew time was running out. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated case. The evidence was pointing to a pattern, a chilling one that had stretched across years and maybe across state lines. Dean Holloway might not have been acting alone. A former counselor at Camp Mariner, now living in Mississippi, mentioned that during the summer of '85, there were nights when Dean would disappear for hours. No one thought to report it because camp life was chaotic and he wasn't assigned to any bunkhouse. But what if those were the nights something terrible happened? Back in Fairhope, Linda Reynolds received an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Two girls standing in front of an unfamiliar wooden cabin. One of them looked like Jennifer but older, maybe 11 or 12. The photo had no date, no note, just a cold silence that shook Linda to her core. Could one of the girls have been alive longer than anyone believed? Had someone kept them? Hidden, Rachel was now certain that someone had been watching all along. The wagon in the sea, the buried backpack, the videotape, they weren't just clues. They were pieces someone had allowed to be found at the right time. Like breadcrumbs. Like a game. And if that was true, then whoever was behind this wasn't done. The town was on edge again. News vans parked outside the police station. People whispered in grocery stores and church aisles. And Rachel, sitting at her desk late into the night, kept staring at the map she'd pinned with red markers each, one a moment, a clue, a step closer. But as the lines between locations started to form a pattern, one thing became clear. The truth wasn't buried in one place. It was scattered, hidden across time, wrapped in silence, and someone was still holding the final piece. A cold front had rolled into Fairhope the morning the call came in. It was just after sunrise when a man working at a bait shop near the old marina spotted a figure limping along the dock. Something about him looked familiar, his hunched shoulders, the slow shuffle of his steps. The man dialed the number he'd saved from the news segment, the one urging residents to report any sightings of Dean Holloway. Within the hour, Rachel and her team were at the marina. Moving quickly and quietly along the weathered planks, they found Dean sitting alone at the edge of the dock, staring out at the gray waves. His hands were tucked into the sleeves of a weather-beaten coat, and his face looked older than his years-sunken eyes, deep creases, a kind of hollowness that couldn't be faked. He didn't run. When Rachel approached, he simply turned his head and said, "I knew you'd find me. Took longer than I thought." They brought him in without a struggle. The room where he was questioned was silent, except for the hum of a recorder. At first, Dean said nothing, just sat there, blinking slowly. But when Rachel showed him the photograph of the girls at Camp Mariner and the backpack found under the tree line, something shifted. He leaned forward and whispered, "They were never supposed to get hurt. I just wanted them to come with me. Just for a little while." That admission cracked the case open. Dean confessed to taking Abby and Jennifer that day, luring them away with the promise of a secret adventure at the camp. They followed him, thinking it was a game. He said they stayed hidden in a cabin for almost 2 days, laughing, drawing pictures, playing like it was all one big sleepover. But when one of the girls, Jennifer, started asking to go home, panicking, he realized he couldn't keep them there forever. And that's when everything went wrong. He claimed he tried to get help, to talk himself into letting them go. But fear took over. He panicked, and in a moment of desperation, he drugged their food. Only he got the doses wrong. Abby never woke up. Jennifer was still breathing when he left the cabin that night. He said he couldn't face what he'd done, so he fled. When he came back the next morning, the cabin was empty. That part didn't make sense. Rachel pressed him, who moved the girls. What happened after he left? Dean's eyes flicked up, suddenly alert. "I wasn't the only one," he said. "I never was. Someone else was watching that camp." That twist dropped like a stone. 4. 15 years, Dean had been the ghost everyone chased. But now he was pointing toward someone else, another adult. Someone who had access to the camp, maybe even someone in authority. Rachel ran with the lead. She reopened records, checking camp staff, volunteers, and even part-time workers. And that's when she saw it a maintenance man listed only by initials, TR, no full name. No background check, no home address. Just temporary summer hire. A buried detail, further digging, uncovered the name Thomas Redley, a former groundskeeper. Never officially registered with the camp's parent organization. His employment history was patchy, drifting from town to town. He'd left Fairhope just days after the girls vanished. But he had returned to Baldwin County in 1999, just months. Before the wagon was pulled from the sea, it explained so much. If Dean had abandoned the girls and Redley found them, he could have taken over. Perhaps he moved Jennifer. Maybe he kept her hidden. Maybe she survived longer than anyone knew. That part remained unclear. But what was clear now was that Redley had a connection to the location where the backpack was buried. Records showed he'd done contract work on that property in 1997, cutting trees, digging trenches. Rachel issued a warrant. Redley's small house, nestled in thick woods on the edge of the county line, looked deserted at first. But inside, the basement told another story. There were boxes of old VHS tapes, drawings on faded paper, and a dusty shoebox filled with personal items that matched ones belonging to missing children. Not just Abby and Jennifer, but others. Kids whose faces had once been printed on milk cartons. And in the corner of the basement was a narrow crawl space. Inside it, police found a locked chest. When they forced it open, what they found wasn't remains, but a journal. Jennifer's journal. Her name was written in the top corner of the first page in the neat, looping letters of a 10-year-old. The entries were heartbreaking. Some described the first few days at the cabin, playing with her sister. Others became more confused, scared. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The last entry was dated 2 weeks after they disappeared. Jennifer had been alive for at least that long. The journal was enough. Thomas Redley was arrested 2 days later in a motel outside Mobile, trying to flee. Unlike Dean, he didn't talk, not at first. But the evidence was overwhelming. He had taken Jennifer after Dean left her. He had kept her for some time. What happened after that, he refused to say. Both men were charged. Dean accepted a plea deal and gave a full statement, confirming he had returned to the camp a few days later and helped Redley sink the wagon to destroy evidence. He thought it would all stay buried, but the sea had other plans. In court, Linda Reynolds sat silently, clutching her daughter's last school photo. When the verdicts were read, she didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear. But as the town began to settle, thinking the nightmare was over, Rachel received a call that shook her to the core. A DNA test had been quietly run on items found in the basement chest. Among them was a single strand of hair, carefully wrapped in tissue. The results came back a match not to Jennifer, but to a different girl. A girl who vanished from Louisiana in 1982. A case never linked. A girl no one had ever connected to Camp Mariner, which meant the truth went even deeper. The story of the Reynolds sisters was just one thread in a web that stretched across states and years. Rachel stood at the edge of something even darker than she imagined. The case had reached its climax, but the shadows behind it were just beginning to show. Because while justice had been served in part, not every secret had come to light, and not every child had been found. The months that followed were a blur of court hearings, interviews, and quiet reckonings. Fairhope, once a sleepy coastal town, had become a national headline again. But this time, it wasn't just about the disappearance of 2 young sisters. It was about the cracks in a system that allowed something so unthinkable to stay hidden for so long. The cases of Abby and Jennifer Reynolds were finally closed, but their story opened doors to others that had gone cold. Rachel Monroe found herself working with agencies from other states, linking missing persons cases, comparing evidence, and piecing together the broader picture. It was bigger than Fairhope, bigger than anyone had realized. For Linda Reynolds, the truth came with a complicated weight. After 15 years of hoping, praying, imagining every possible outcome, she finally had answers. But they weren't the answers a mother wants. She held on to the journal Rachel gave her, the one Jennifer had written in during those lost weeks. Reading her daughter's words brought tears, but also peace. she now knew that Jennifer had held on to hope, even in the darkest moments. Linda placed the journal beside Abby's favorite storybook on their shelf, where it would stay untouched as a quiet tribute. Dean Holloway received a life sentence. His confession, paired with the evidence found in the camp and the video footage, left no doubt about his involvement. His remorse, whether genuine or born from guilt catching up with him, mattered little in the eyes of the law. He would never walk free again. But it was Thomas Redley who left the deepest scar. During his trial, he refused to speak. Even after conviction, he remained silent. Investigators searched every property he had ever lived on, hoping to find remains or evidence tied to the other children. Some pieces were found, small items, bits of truth, but no definitive answers on what happened to the other missing kids. The question that haunted Rachel most was the one she couldn't answer: how many more were there? Tyler Grant, the blogger turned investigator, published a series on the Reynolds case that went viral. His storytelling, raw, personal, and deeply empathetic, resonated with readers across the country. He dedicated the final entry to Jennifer's journal and the bravery it took for a young girl to write her truth, even in fear. The series brought new attention to forgotten cold cases. Some families reached out to Rachel directly, sharing their own stories, asking for help, or simply wanting someone to listen. Back in Fairhope, the town slowly returned to its rhythms. Kids rode bikes past the same sidewalks Abby and Jennifer once played on. The red wagon, now preserved and placed behind glass in the local historical society, became a symbol of loss, yes, but also of resilience. Visitors left flowers and hand-drawn pictures near it, many from children who had grown up hearing the story. For the community, remembering the girls wasn't just about tragedy. It was about how people came together even after years of silence. To seek justice and truth, Rachel stayed in town for a while longer. She'd been offered promotions, positions in bigger cities, even media deals, but she declined them all. She felt she owed something to Fairhope, to the Reynolds family, and to every family whose stories hadn't yet been told. She kept digging through the cold case files in storage, organizing, reopening ones that had been forgotten. She believed there were still answers, out there still. Lives that could be brought into the light. She also spent more time with Linda. The two women, separated by decades in age, but bonded by truth and pain, often met for coffee or quiet walks near the beach. They didn't always talk about the case. Sometimes they just sat in silence, watching the water move with the tide. Rachel asked once if Linda regretted staying in Fairhope. Linda smiled faintly and said, "It's where they lived. It's where they laughed. I want to stay close to that." The final unexpected twist came 6 months later, long after the news had quieted and the courtrooms had emptied. A call came from a woman in Mississippi. Her name was Ellen King, and she believed she was Jennifer Reynolds. She said she'd been adopted in 1986 under unusual circumstances and had recently started searching her past. Her DNA matched through a national database thanks to Rachel's open inquiries. Confirmed it she was, in fact, Jennifer. The world shifted again. It turned out Redley hadn't killed her. He had kept her hidden for a while, drugged, manipulated, but eventually left her at a hospital with a false story. Records were faked. She was placed in foster care and adopted. She remembered almost nothing from her early years, just flashes of a wagon, the smell of salt, and a girl with curly hair who made her laugh. When she met Linda, it was quiet, tearful, and full of long embraces. There were no words to fill that kind of gap, only time. Jennifer, now an adult with a life of her own, began learning about the sister she lost, the town that searched for her, and the mother who never gave up. Fairhope became whole in a way no one expected. Not perfect, not healed entirely, but no longer haunted. The story that had once ended in silence now carried voices. real ones, ones that reminded everyone watching, reading, or listening that sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes the sea gives something back. Sometimes the truth surfaces even. After all, hope seems lost. And in the quiet spaces where grief and love meet, where memory lingers and justice finally speaks, people remember. They remember the girls in the wagon, the stories left behind, and the power of never letting go.